Human papillomavirus, or HPV, is one of the big ones within the world of virology. They claim that it is affecting people everywhere, whether it be in the form of warts or cervical abnormalities, including cancer. They claim that it passes around through skin and sexual contact with the greatest of ease. And the end response from the medico-pharmaceutical industry to this alleged virus has been vaccines, of course. Let's have a look at the mainstream world of HPV to see how an imaginary particle has been blamed for conditions that have other causes. You can't catch it through skin or sexual contact because there is no it. So how and why are children and adolescents around the world being injected with a vaccine for something that doesn't exist? The United States CDC states that HPV is the most common sexually transmitted infection. There were about 43 million HPV infections in 2018, many among people in their late teens and early 20s. There are many different types of HPV. Some types can cause health problems, including genital warts and cancers. But there are vaccines that can stop these health problems from happening. In reality, there is no scientific study that provides any direct evidence of an infectious process taking place between humans. Hence, blaming warts and cancers on imagined viruses and contagion will not help with understanding these problems. HPV is one of those, quote, viruses like herpes, where the medical establishment claims that virtually everyone has it. It is being spread around relentlessly, most of the time not causing much harm, but sometimes it can lead to your death. As the CDC goes on to say, in most cases, 9 out of 10, HPV goes away on its own within 2 years without health problems. But when HPV does not go away, it can cause health problems like genital warts and cancer. In other words, a ubiquitous scapegoat that can be blamed even though on their own terms they'll admit that the vast majority of the time it is, quote, found, it doesn't cause these diseases. However, this circular reasoning is commenced when the CDC reports that there is no test to find out a person's HPV status. So if that's the case, how is it diagnosed? Health disinformation site Wikipedia reports that genital warts are the only visible sign of low-risk genital HPV and can be identified with a visual check. In other words, the condition, a wart, is conflated with evidence of a, quote, virus, even though they have no test. The CDC do, however, claim that there are HPV tests that can screen for cervical cancer. Once again, a condition, cancer, is being conflated with a supposed virus. And what is the evidence for these claims? At this point, we can look to a 2015 publication in the Journal of Clinical Virology titled HPV Testing for Primary Cervical Screening. Of note, they reported that the HPV assays used in the trials were the hybrid capture-2, HC2, and the general primer 5/6 PCR EIA. Both of these tests are molecular detection tests. They do not require the existence of viruses to give a positive result. The hybrid capture-2 assay uses RNA probes to hybridize or join with similar DNA sequences that are claimed to come from HPV, and then an antibody said to be specific to these hybrids is employed with a luminescent reaction to indicate its presence. The PCR, which many of you are familiar with by now, simply amplifies DNA sequences said to be HPV specific. However, in this case, to aid their genetic fishing expedition, they report that general or consensus primer-mediated PCR assays have been developed to detect a broad spectrum of genital HPV genotypes in one PCR. In other words, many different DNA sequence variations can cause a positive reaction, with their reasoning being that these represent the variants of the imagined virus. It is another example of the virologists' circular reasoning. They are claiming that these genetic sequences come from inside viruses, and therefore detecting these sequences means they have evidence of viruses. What is missing is the steps that show the actual existence of infectious particles, and that the sequences come from inside such particles. The virologist's logical fallacy has been pointed out for decades. For example, since the 1990s, the Perth Group have shown that claimed, quote, HIV sequences were never shown to come from the proposed HIV particles. In recent years, many more of us have pointed out the same issue with SARS-CoV-2, among other logical gaps. The claimed virus does not exist as the assembled sequences have never been shown to be viral in nature. With HPV, it is no different. There is no demonstration of the sequences coming from an entity that meets the definition of a virus. By all accounts, they are simply variations of genetic sequences found in human tissue. It is a problem we encounter with everyone who claims that disease-causing viruses exist. They want to start the conversation with the false premise that genetic databases contain evidence of viruses and that their phylogenetic trees show variants and evolving pathogens. However, it is a paradigm of fictional constructs. In A Farewell to Virology, his formal refutation of the virus model, my husband Mark used the example of SARS-CoV-2 to expose the fraud. In the section Turtles All the Way Down, he outlined how the trail of, quote, coronavirus genomes leads back to publications in the 1980s that provide no evidence that the genetic sequences are viral in provenance, just like HPV. But what about those pictures claiming to show evidence of HPV? For example, in 1990, a team of researchers obtained surgically removed warts, which were then homogenized and ultracentrifuged. An electron micrograph image is shown in Figure 1, which they claim represents, quote, purified HPV. But were these alleged particles shown to be infectious or disease-causing? No. They were claimed to be viral on the basis of DNA sequences detected through hybridization, the problem of which I've just discussed. They engaged in further circular reasoning with electron microscopy antibody reactions, claimed to be specific to HPV. We can see that even on their own terms, they have a problem here, because in their control group, said not to have warts, half of the adult subjects also had positive antibody reactions in their blood samples. They disingenuously included some infants who were all without positive antibody tests in an attempt to make the figures look better. This is an invalid comparison, as the youngest patients in the wart group were 9-year-olds. Besides the fact that there is no way that these antibody assays show specificity, even on their own terms, there is another issue with the study. If they purported to show viruses from the wart samples, where were the comparative electron micrographs? That is, samples taken from healthy skin and skin with other diseases. When we go back to the methods section where they describe patients and control subjects, we see that control sera were collected from 6 healthy infants aged 6 to 12 months and from 18 laboratory workers aged 25 to 59 years. In other words, they only took blood samples for comparison, not skin samples. So they didn't check if particles that looked the same could also be found in the absence of warts. So you can see that there is layer upon layer of missing evidence here. Even if the visualized particles are related to warts, there is no evidence that they are the causative element, in particular being viral in nature. Similarly, if the detected DNA sequences relate to disease, whether it be in warts or cervical cancer, there is again no evidence that such sequences are viral in origin. And the antibody assays are so non-specific that they are farcical, even on their own terms. When we go back to the HPV testing for primary cervical screening publication, it states that for cervical screening and disease management, the priority is for detection of infections associated with lesions or lesion development. Hence, the HPV test is not strictly a viral test where high analytical sensitivity is prized, but rather a test for oncogenic risk. This sort of sentence may impress those that are naive to the fraud of virology, but can be rejected as a scientific sleight of hand. The HPV test is not strictly a viral test. Should read, the HPV test is not and never was a viral test. A so-called viral test has to go beyond analytical sensitivity and specificity for genetic sequences or some other alleged correlation. However, that can't be done because there's no evidence of the thing that they are purporting to validate the sequence against. That is, an actual infectious HPV particle. In Chapter 8 of Virus Mania, with regard to cervical cancer and the supposed existence of HPV, we outlined the questions we put to the DKFZ, known in English as the German Cancer Research Centre. We wrote, can we really believe the methods of virus detection? The DKFZ sent us a, quote, wonderful literature list, in which there were 2 studies both conducted by Zurhausen et al. That they claim serve as proofs for the first isolation of specific HPV from cervical cancer tissue. The first of these 2 papers, published in 1983 in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a papillomavirus DNA from a cervical carcinoma and its prevalence in cancer biopsy samples from different geographic regions, lacks the following critical issues. It is not clear where the cloned DNA of the presumed virus comes from. Without knowing the origin of the DNA, it is impossible to prove that a virus was there. A large number of cervical tumours were screened without success, increasing the possibility that the discovery of one tumour with this DNA is just a coincidence. The authors use the term non-stringent conditions, which probably means that hybridization occurred with less than a perfect match. That is to say, the 2 DNA strands they were using were not identical. Of course, they will just say that viruses mutate rapidly, David Crowe points out, but this is pure speculation. We highlighted several other concerns to the DKFZ about these claimed foundational HPV papers and asked them for clarification, but they never responded. And even if they sincerely believe that HPV exists, the claim that it causes cervical cancer is preposterous. Within their own paradigm, the epidemiology reveals that only around 0.1% of the women said to be, quote, infected with HPV end up developing cervical cancer. So it's little wonder that the CDC states there is no way to know who will develop cancer or other health problems from HPV. Those of us that have seen through the methodologies of the virologists can help them with their dilemma and point out that exactly none of them will get these conditions from a fictional invention that has no basis in science. At this point, we can see that they have no evidence that a particle that meets the description of a virus actually exists. If the particle has not been shown to exist, there can be no way to validate any tests said to detect such a particle. Thus, there can be no way to show anyone is, quote, infected with these particles, or that they spread between humans, or that they cause any health problems. Unfortunately, most people won't look into any of this and instead say, yes, but there's a vaccine. So how could they make a vaccine without a virus? This is the oldest trick in the book and has been cited since Edward Jenner published an inquiry into the causes and effects of the variole vaccine or cowpox in 1798. As Mike Stone wrote in his comprehensive article on Jenner's activities, which I'll link in the show notes, these inoculations entail taking the pus from the infected scabs of people suffering cowpox, cutting open the skin of a healthy subject with a lancet, and spreading this impure material into the wound. If they were to develop disease and recover, they would then be considered immune to smallpox. HPV vaccines are based on more sophisticated biotechnology, although the same filthy practice of injecting disease-related products into the body remains. Pharmaceuticals such as the Gardasil vaccine contain various proteins that are alleged to come from HPV particles. For the same reasons I've just gone over with regard to DNA sequences, this is a fraudulent claim, as these proteins have never been shown to belong to any virus. Mainstream theory claims that these antigenic proteins in the vaccine will prime the, quote, immune system to defend itself against the supposed viruses in the future. In reality, the injection will cause an inflammatory response, which is the last thing the body needs. As if it is not foolish enough to inject unwanted foreign proteins into the body, Gardasil comes with extra toxicity in the form of 500 micrograms of aluminium, or as our US friends say, aluminum. Aluminium is a heavy metal and the human body has no need for any. The reason that it is added to vaccines is due to the claim that it generates a stronger, quote, immune response. I'll address why this is a euphemism for what actually happens in an upcoming video focusing on aluminium and vaccines. It is bad enough to ingest aluminium from contaminated environmental sources, but it is far worse to be injected with aluminium, as it bypasses some of the body's clearance mechanisms. In fact, even the US Department of Health and Human Services 2008 publication, Toxicological Profile for Aluminium, states that gastrointestinal absorption of aluminium is low, generally in the range of 0.1 to 0.4% in humans. So more than 99% of it is not absorbed and passes straight out in the feces. On the other hand, most of the injected aluminium will end up being sequestered into the brain and bones, potentially setting up time bombs in these areas for the later manifestation of disease. Combined with other vaccines on many childhood schedules, it is apparent that Gardasil has added further toxicity in the cumulative aluminium burden. Most parents have no idea, of course, that they are subjecting their children to such heavy metal poisoning. So this is the end result in the story that has been created around HPV, a toxic vaccine foisted onto an unsuspecting population for a, quote, virus that has never been shown to exist. Warts are almost universally self-limiting, and to be frank, I'm yet to see a good explanation for their cause. It may simply be the body's way of walling off an unwanted toxin. We know from animal studies in which, quote, papillomaviruses are blamed, that warty lesions are only induced by traumatizing the skin first. At the end of the day, despite all the various treatments employed against warts, they tend to resolve themselves. With regard to cervical cancer, the fictional HPV is certainly not the cause, but even those who believe there is such a virus cannot demonstrate internal consistency with their own model. I'll dedicate a future video to the topic of cervical cancer, as well as the misleading smear tests, which result in all sorts of unnecessary interventions. With any of these health topics, your best bet is not to fight disease, but to practice good health. In this regard, you can check out all the resources we provide for free at drsambailey.com. Please also consider securing a copy of my book, Terrain Therapy, for comprehensive information about not only avoiding medical tests and vaccines, but so much more. Right thinking and right living is within everyone's reach, and I hope you'll continue on this journey with me. If you enjoyed this video, please visit supportdrsam.com